Some say the trees in Miller's Hollow were watered with blood. Others say the orchard itself chooses where it grows, and who must die next. But no one denies this. The fruit of the devil's orchard has fed generations of death. Tucked deep in the forgotten hills of old West Virginia lies a place that time did not just forget. It buried. The locals once called it Miller's Hollow. Today, there's no sign left but a crooked iron fence swallowed by the forest and a stretch of trees that shouldn't be there. Trees that bloom in the dead of winter. Trees that bleed when you cut them. The earliest settlers found the land by accident in the winter of 1851. They were homesteaders, war deserters, widows, and debtors. People with nowhere else to go. But what they found waiting for them was more than fertile land. It was a gift or a warning. A wild orchard stood in the middle of the hollow. Dozens of apple trees in perfect alignment. Far too perfect for nature's hand. Their bark was dark and slick, and their roots twisted above the soil like veins. The fruit, locals said, ripened faster than any they'd seen. Blood-red apples with no seeds. Bitter pears that dripped sap like tears. And once you bit into one, you were never quite the same. Old county ledgers mention the town being founded the year after the orchard was discovered. But the hollow never had a proper post office nor a church. Just farms, a schoolhouse, and the trees. Always the trees. One child, Lena Bridger, age 9, wrote in a preserved schoolbook, "Teacher says the orchard makes shadows that don't match the sun. Mama says don't go near it when the wind stops. That's when the roots listen." The town prospered at first. Crops grew tall. Livestock fattened fast. And the orchard? It never stopped bearing fruit. But with each harvest came another loss. A child vanished. A man took ill and rotted from the inside. A woman walked into the orchard and never came out, though her voice was heard whispering in the trees for days. Still they stayed, because hunger is louder than fear, and the land, whatever cursed power it held, kept giving, until it started taking more than anyone could afford. This was the beginning of the devil's orchard, and it remembers everyone who ever tasted its fruit. By the spring of 1857, Miller's Hollow had grown into something resembling a proper settlement. 23 families, one schoolhouse, and an orchard that never stopped giving. It bloomed through frost, through drought, through years when every other crop withered. No one questioned the trees anymore, not out loud. But that spring, the orchard bloomed unlike any year before. Thick, crimson blossoms choked the branches so heavily that the trees looked aflame from a distance. The air around the hollow smelled of rot and flowers. And the fruit, God help them, was heavier, wetter. Some claimed it dripped blood when plucked. People began to whisper that something had changed, that the orchard was waiting. Then came the girl. Her name was Clara Dunley, 11 years old. Blonde, freckled, curious. She disappeared while walking home from school, last seen by the edge of the orchard picking what she called a bleeding apple. Her small footprints led into the grove, but there were none coming out. The town searched for 3 days. Dogs refused to enter the trees. A group of men with lanterns and rifles swept the grove row by row. Nothing. No body. No clothing. No blood. But on the third morning the fruit changed. A single tree at the heart of the orchard bore one apple larger than any the town had seen. Smooth, scarlet, beating softly, like a heartbeat. That same night, the air turned warm and still. The wind died, and at midnight, every tree in the orchard dropped its fruit at once. In the morning, Clara's bonnet was found hanging from a low branch, clean, untouched, still tied neatly beneath the chin. What followed became known as the first bloom. The orchard produced more fruit than ever before. Twice the normal yield, heavy and dark and shining. The town's economy boomed. They sold crates to cities miles away. They bought tools, built homes, and never spoke of Clara again. That year, the townsfolk didn't bury a single person. Not from illness, not from injury, not from age. They took it as a blessing. But some, especially the oldest families, understood. It was a trade. The orchard had accepted an offering. And from that year forward, the pattern became clear. Each spring, just before the bloom, someone would vanish. Sometimes it was a child. sometimes a drifter. Sometimes it was a name pulled from a hat no one admitted to writing. But the fruit always came. And so did the silence. A diary found decades later in the attic of the Miller homestead bore only one entry from 1857, written in a shaky hand. One for the orchard, and none for the grave. So the rest of US may live another year. The orchard had made its pact. And the town, hungry, grateful, afraid, chose to honor it. By the time the second bloom arrived in 1858, the people of Miller's Hollow no longer asked why the trees thrived. They only asked who would disappear next. The town had become quiet in a new way. Church bells no longer rang. Children were kept indoors. Neighbors nodded without speaking. And each year, when the orchard swelled with red blossoms and the air turned still, everyone felt it in their bones. The land was choosing. But not all feared it. Thomas Miller, the eldest son of the original settlers, saw opportunity where others saw warning. He'd inherited both the land and his father's ambition. While others whispered about sacrifice, he kept records, yields, patterns, changes in bark texture, sap color. He noticed something no one else admitted. The bigger the loss, the richer the bloom. After the first bloom brought prosperity, the Millers became central to the town. They owned the packing house, controlled the sale routes, and decided when and where the fruit would go. People depended on them. And Thomas understood the price of that power. In the winter of 1861, Thomas made the choice that would seal the family's fate. That year, the trees didn't bloom as usual. Buds withered before opening. Fruit rotted on the branch. The wind returned, and with it came a sound that chilled the whole town. The whispering. Not in the leaves. Beneath the soil. 3 children had vanished in the weeks before. Still, the trees refused to bloom. Something was wrong. Something was owed. That's when Thomas Miller summoned the town's elders. They met in secret beneath the rafters of the schoolhouse. What they discussed would never be written down, but what followed was undeniable. The very next morning, the trees bloomed again. Redder, thicker, heavier. And Thomas's youngest son, Jacob Miller, age 6, was never seen again. Some said he drowned in the well. Others claimed he wandered into the woods during the night. But no one searched for him. Not even his own family. The orchard had made it clear. This time it wanted blood. Not borrowed. Not stolen. Offered. Thomas Miller never denied it. In fact, a single line was scratched into the back of his ledger from that year. To keep what we've built, the hollow must bleed. From that moment on, the Miller name became both revered and feared. Every bloom, it was said, began with a visit to their home. Some whispered that the family had learned to speak to the orchard. Others believed they'd simply given in to it, made themselves stewards of its hunger. Whatever the truth, one thing became certain. So long as the Millers paid the debt, the town would survive. And so, each spring, as the wind stopped and the ground softened, the townsfolk would wait. A name would vanish, and the trees would bloom. By the spring of 1867, the orchard was no longer a grove, it was a presence. The trees had spread beyond their original borders, reaching into yards, past fences, up the hillsides where no seeds had ever been planted. No one saw them grow. They simply appeared, overnight, and always in perfect lines, as though guided by a deliberate, unseen hand. But it wasn't just the growth that unsettled the town. It was the change. The bark had darkened, taking on a deep reddish hue that shimmered like wet stone in the morning light. The roots had begun to rise through the ground, curling like knotted fingers through floorboards, into cellars across graves. And the sap ran red. At first, people called it iron-rich, a trick of the soil. But when livestock refused to eat fallen fruit, and children woke with bleeding gums after biting into orchard apples, denial became harder to hold on to. Then came the day it rained. A late spring storm rolled through Miller's Hollow. Lightning, wind, and heavy rain soaked the land. The next morning, dozens of trees were found weeping, thick crimson sap running down their trunks like open wounds. It stained the ground. It soaked through wooden shoes. It smelled of copper and earth. That day became known as the bleeding rain. The town doctor, A man named Elias Ward collected a sample. He stored it in a glass vial in his office, determined to analyze it. But before he could, he was found dead, collapsed over his desk, the vial shattered on the floor. His mouth was stained red. His notes, found beside him, held only a single phrase. "It's not sap. It remembers." From that point forward, the orchard stopped being a secret. It was an entity, and it began to push back. Roots crept into homes, cracking foundations. Trees began growing in places they'd never dared before. In the graveyard, in the schoolhouse yard, even inside the miller's own parlor. It was as if the land had grown restless, or hungry. Families began to move away, but not all made it far. Roads washed out. Horses collapsed. One man, Reuben Haskett, reportedly ran screaming into the orchard, claiming he could hear his daughter, buried the year before, calling his name from the roots. His body was never recovered. But 3 days later, a tree grew on his doorstep. Its bark bore the imprint of a human hand. The town no longer asked for blessings from the land. It made offerings, quietly, desperately. Sometimes they were animals, sometimes not. In a journal recovered from the ruins of the town's chapel, the preacher, Reverend Amos Crane, wrote in trembling script, "We built on graves. We planted over bones. Now the bones want to grow." The orchard had been fed, and now its roots ran red with memory. By the 1870s, Miller's Hollow was no longer a town. It was a warning wrapped in silence. No trains stopped there. Mail came less frequently. Travelers who passed through often left the same day, pale and unwilling to explain why. The orchard, once the pride of the region, had become a living monument to quiet dread. Its fruit was still harvested, still sold, still packed by hands that trembled, but no one ate it locally anymore. Not after the children began to disappear. It started with the Maddox twins. Elsie and Ruth, both age 8, vanished one foggy morning while walking to school. Their mother swore she watched them turn the corner onto Orchard Lane, just 20 steps from the house. They never arrived. Their shoes were found side by side beneath a tree whose bark was slick with red sap. The next day, that same tree bloomed again weeks early. And then, it happened again. Samuel Cutter, age 10, disappeared while fishing near the South Grove. His fishing pole was found standing upright in the soil, his jacket folded neatly on the ground, dry despite the rain. That night, 3 trees blossomed near the Cutter home. No one touched their fruit. Parents began to forbid their children from going outside alone. School was canceled indefinitely, but the orchard didn't care. It had tasted innocence and it wanted more. Then came the whispers. Children who hadn't vanished began to speak of strange voices near the trees. They'd hear their names being called, not by strangers but by other children. Voices soft and trembling, calling from beneath the roots. "It's dark," one girl whispered to her mother. "Ruth says it's so dark underground." Some children drew strange images. Figures hanging upside down inside trees, mouths sewn shut, limbs twisted like branches. One boy, Henry Fleece, was found digging in the orchard at night with his bare hands, mumbling, "They want to come home." The town's elders, desperate and afraid, convened again at the old Miller house. What they decided that night was never written down, but shortly after, the disappearances stopped for a time, and the orchard bloomed heavier than ever. Years later, a buried lockbox was found beneath the floor of the Miller basement. Inside was a bundle of drawings, all made by children. Some were dated years apart but showed the same image. Rows of trees with faces in the bark. Eyes wide, mouths open, screaming. The last image, marked with a scrawled date, 1879, showed the orchard swallowing a house whole. At the bottom of the box, in the same stiff handwriting found in other Miller records, was a single sentence. "The orchard does not take what is not given. But if we wait too long, it chooses for itself." The children were not taken. They were claimed. And now the town had a decision to make: feed the roots, or risk them feeding themselves. For nearly 3 decades, the orchard had been fed in silence. The townspeople of Miller's Hollow whispered their sins, offered their dead, and watched the trees grow tall on secrets. But in the fall of 1882, one man refused to bow to the roots. His name was Reverend Jonathan Ezra Crane, a preacher from Kentucky with fire in his voice and Bible in hand. He arrived in Miller's Hollow on horseback, summoned by a distant cousin who had heard tales of a cursed village with no church, no sermons, and no fear of God. Crane was young, defiant, and stubbornly righteous. The moment he saw the orchard, he knew. "This is unholy ground," he said, standing before the withering gate that led into the grove. "You've let it feed too long." The town was indifferent. They'd heard men like him before, outsiders full of verses and brimstone. They always left before the trees bloomed, or they didn't leave at all. But Crane was different. He didn't run. He preached from the steps of the abandoned schoolhouse, warning that the devil himself had taken root in the hollow, that what they called a pact was no better than blood worship. Some listened. Most stayed away. Then he made a decision that would curse him forever. On the first day of spring, when the trees began to swell with that unnatural red blossom, Reverend Crane walked alone into the orchard, robes billowing, crucifix in hand, and began to pray. Witnesses said the wind stopped the moment he opened his mouth. He read scripture for over an hour, voice steady, hands trembling. The ground beneath him cracked. Birds fled. Somewhere in the trees, something began to hum. Not a sound, but a low vibration that made the air feel thick. Then came the screaming. Not his, not yet. The townsfolk found him the next morning lying at the center of the orchard. His clothes soaked, not with rain or dew, but with red sap that stained his skin like blood. He was alive, but only just. He never spoke again. Crane was taken to the old rectory, where he wasted away for weeks. His hands blistered, his mouth twisted into a frozen grimace. And then, one night, he vanished from his bed. The window was locked, the door bolted. But outside, near the eastern row of trees, a new sapling had sprouted overnight. His bark was pale, his shape wrong, and carved into its trunk, barely visible beneath the bleeding sap, were the letters J.E.C. Years later, a boy exploring the orchard found a page torn from a Bible, pressed between two branches. It was warped and brittle, but the verse was still legible. "And the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, with their households and all the men who belonged to Korah." Numbers 16:32. The orchard had spoken. It would not be blessed. It would not be cleansed. It had swallowed preachers, prayers, and promises alike. And from that day forward, no holy man would ever enter Miller's Hollow again. By 1894, Miller's Hollow had shrunk to fewer than 30 souls. The land still bore fruit, the trees still bled in the spring, and the wind still fell silent before someone, disappeared. But now, even the old families were afraid to speak the orchard's name aloud. All except one. Gideon Miller, the last living heir of Thomas Miller, had inherited everything: the land, the records, and the blood-soaked legacy of his family's pact with the orchard. He was 31 when the final bloom came early. Too early. It was still snowing in March when the trees awoke. No one had vanished. No sacrifice had been made. No name had been whispered. Yet the orchard bloomed like never before. Rows upon rows of blossoms, glowing red against the snow. The ground steamed. The sap boiled in the bark. Gideon knew what it meant. For generations, the Millers had offered what the orchard required. Some gave neighbors. Some gave strangers. A few, like Thomas, gave their own blood. But Gideon had refused. He'd buried the ledgers, burned the old journals, tried to sell the land, tried to flee. But the orchard would not let him leave. 3 times he packed his bags. 3 times the roads collapsed behind him. Once, his horse went mad in the middle of the forest and impaled itself on a broken limb. When he tried to walk out on foot, the trail turned back in on itself, miles shrinking into loops. One night, in a final act of desperation, Gideon locked himself inside the family homestead and set it ablaze. The fire raged. The roof collapsed. The orchard stood in eerie silence as smoke rose above the hollow. But in the morning the house remained. Blackened, yes, charred and broken, but still standing. And in the center of the living room, untouched by flame, was Gideon's father's chair. Roots had grown up through the floor and curled around its legs like hands. That evening, Gideon began writing his final journal. What survived of it was found decades later, in a rusted tin box buried beside the hearth. It reads more like a confession than a diary. Pages filled with manic handwriting, scratched into the paper as though carved by fingernail. One passage stands out above the rest. The orchard is not fed by blood alone. It drinks guilt. It grows on silence. We thought we gave it lives. But we gave it time. Time to remember. Time to choose. The last entry, written in a smear of ink and what appeared to be blood, read, "I hear them now. All of them. Every branch bears a name. Every leaf is a tongue. The trees are calling for me." Gideon was never seen again. But a week later, a new tree grew at the center of the orchard. Taller than the rest, its bark split open like a wound. Locals claimed they could see his face in it if they looked long enough. Some say it whispered. Some say it wept. No Miller has ever been born in West Virginia since. The line ended that year, as if the orchard had finally claimed its debt in full. And yet, the trees still bloom. By 1962, Miller's Hollow had long since vanished from official records. The roads were gone. The bridges collapsed. The town's name erased from county maps as if it had never existed at all. But the orchard remained. And it was no longer content to be forgotten. That spring, something changed. It began with a USGS aerial survey, a routine flyover for mapping rural land in Appalachia. What should have been a cluster of wild trees inside a long-abandoned valley was something else entirely. The orchard had grown, not just in width but in pattern. The photos revealed precise rows, unnaturally straight, geometrically perfect, stretching far beyond the original borders of Miller's Hollow. The shapes resembled crop fields, but no farmer in the region had touched that land in over 40 years. A technician reviewing the negatives noticed something even stranger. The orchard's expansion aligned with the grave sites of nearby abandoned churches and family burial plots. It was as if the trees were tracing death itself, growing over the forgotten dead. The report was filed, then buried, but the trees kept spreading. By autumn, hikers in neighboring counties began reporting strange encounters. A Boy Scout troop from Elkins, West Virginia, claimed to find apple trees deep in the Monongahela forest, trees that dripped red sap and grew in perfect lines. One scout, Mikey Thorne, was found days later alone and barefoot, repeating the phrase, "They don't sleep. They root and reach and remember." Soon after, a small farming family living 15 miles from the old hollow reported trees sprouting in their cornfield overnight. No seeds had been planted, no saplings purchased, just a ring of young trees standing motionless under a full moon, their bark slick with something that smelled like rust. They cut them down. They burned them. They left the next morning without explanation. As word spread, a local botanist, Dr. Helen Shaw, launched a private investigation. She'd heard rumors of Miller's Hollow as a child. Her grandmother once spoke of it as a place where fruit grows on guilt. First, she was skeptical. Then, she saw the satellite imagery. Dr. Shaw made 3 visits to the edge of the hollow between August and October of 1962. Each time, she went farther. On her final trip, she brought a tape recorder. That tape was found 2 weeks later near an abandoned ranger station, along with her satchel. Inside were samples of bark, soil, and one half-rotted apple wrapped in cloth. Dr. Shaw herself was never found. The last 3 minutes of the tape are filled with static, wind, and whispering. But one phrase cuts through, repeated in a trembling voice, presumably hers. "They're not growing out. They're growing toward something." The orchard wasn't spreading randomly. It was searching. Before her disappearance in the fall of 1962, Dr. Helen Shaw was considered one of the most respected plant pathologists in the eastern United States. She had studied rare fungi in the Ozarks, cataloged invasive moss in the Blue Ridge, and published widely on forest ecosystems. But none of that prepared her for what she found in Miller's Hollow. She first heard the name in passing during a folklore conference in Charleston. An elderly speaker mentioned a bleeding orchard that grows on the backs of the dead. Shaw was skeptical but curious. She began researching quietly. No official records, no maps, but stories persisted. Her grandmother had once whispered to her as a child, "Some roots don't pull up when you try, they pull you down with them." By August of 1962, Shaw had gathered enough obscure references and archived aerial footage to pinpoint what she believed was the remains of Miller's Hollow. She filed no formal expedition plan. Instead, she left a handwritten note to a colleague that simply read, "If the trees are growing like this, it's not a mutation. It's intent." She brought only essentials: a field kit, recording device, and 2 weeks of food. On her first visit, she reached the edge of the orchard and collected bark samples. She noted that the sap wasn't just red. It coagulated like blood and contained iron levels consistent with human plasma. Her second visit was deeper. She marked the trees with chalk as she went, but when she turned back, the chalk was gone. The marks had been absorbed by the bark itself. Her tape recordings from this trip are still preserved. There's no wildlife, no birdsong, not even insects. The wind doesn't move the trees. They move on their own. By her third and final visit in late October, something had changed. Her last recorded message was erratic. She spoke quickly, breathless, often whispering. The audio was distorted, but one section is clear. It's not an orchard. It's a system, a network. Each tree, it remembers something, a death, a voice, maybe even a name. The roots, they're connecting them. They're learning. The last 40 seconds of the recording descend into static until a sound cuts through, a low thumping, rhythmic, wet, like something moving beneath the ground. When a search team followed her trail 2 weeks later, they found her satchel hanging from a crooked branch. Inside was a journal, water-stained but legible. The final page had only one line, carved into the leather in her own handwriting. "I've seen the heart of it, and it is not dead." No remains were ever found. But 3 days after the search was called off, a new tree sprouted at the orchard's edge, unlike any other. Its leaves were pale, its bark gray, its shape human. Botanists who studied it later claimed it grew faster than any native tree in West Virginia. But its core couldn't be cut. Tools snapped, saws broke, and axes bounced back. And at night, people claimed to hear something pulsing inside it, like a heartbeat buried in wood. Dr. Shaw was gone, but the orchard had changed. It had absorbed her knowledge. And now, it was listening. In the decades since Dr. Helen Shaw vanished, Miller's Hollow has remained untouched. Officially. No government team has dared to reclaim it. No surveyor has returned with a complete map. Yet from time to time, someone wanders too close, and something always follows them home. The orchard never stopped growing. It simply grew quieter. In the early 2000s, hikers began posting online about strange trees appearing on trails with no root systems. Just standing there, fully formed, their bark damp and dark, bleeding red when scratched. Campers reported finding strange fruit at the base of pine trees. Fruit that didn't match the local ecology. Always red, always glistening, always cold. And then there are the disappearances. A photographer named Kelsey Rourke vanished in 2009 while shooting decaying towns in Appalachia. Her final photo, automatically uploaded to the cloud, showed an orchard at twilight. But the trees were wrong, too tall, too symmetrical. Zooming in, a blurred figure stands between two trunks, arms stretched into the bark like roots. In 2016, a storm unearthed human bones near Milltown, a small farming community once thought unrelated to Miller's Hollow. Carbon dating suggested they were over 150 years old. But the surrounding soil was wet with red sap, and the trees nearby bore no rings. They had not grown by natural means. In 2023, a boy in eastern Kentucky picked an apple from a tree that hadn't been there the day before. He took a single bite. He now lies in a hospital, unable to speak. Every night, he scratches shapes into his sheets. Rows of trees, eyes in the bark, mouths in the roots. A local nurse, curious, brought one of the drawings home. The next morning, a single tree was found growing in her backyard. They say that places like Miller's Hollow vanish from maps because the ground swallows them whole. But the truth is much simpler and far more terrifying. The orchard was never meant to stay in one place. It spreads through memory, through blood, through story. It plants itself in silence, grows in the cracks of grief, and waits in the dark corners of forgotten land. And the fruit still grows, in grocery bins, in roadside stands, in the hands of children who never knew what soil their apples came from. You may have already tasted it. You may have already heard it whispering to you in your dreams. And when the wind stops outside your window, when the trees fall silent, remember this: the orchard chooses, and it remembers everything.